I didn't know my face could ruin my reputation in 3 days, until I saw it pinned to a dating blacklist, dissected by strangers, while I was packing my suitcase for a work trip I had already told her about. 5 minutes earlier, I was thinking about client slides and flight delays. Then my phone buzzed with a message from Megan. "Who did you piss off?" I laughed, until the screenshot loaded. There I was, my photo, my name, a headline that implied deception. Beneath it, a scrolling wall of comments, some casual, some cruel, some quietly dangerous. People speculating about my character, about my body, about my safety as a person to date. One comment read, "Message me privately for details." Another warned women to stay away. My stomach dropped so hard I had to sit on the edge of the bed. I'm a pharmaceutical sales manager. My job depends on trust, on credibility, on walking into hospitals and medical offices with a reputation that precedes me. In a good way. I travel for work. I always say that up front. I had said it to him too. I thought honesty would protect me. It didn't. 3 weeks earlier, I'd matched with Daniel on a dating app. 35. Thoughtful. Calm. The kind of man whose questions made you feel listened to instead of inspected. We talked for 2 weeks before meeting. I told him about my travel schedule early. He said he understood. He worked in education. He knew what long hours did to a personal life. We went to dinner the weekend before Valentine's Day. 3 hours flew by. Conversation that felt easy. Chemistry that felt real. Then I left for a work trip. And when I came back, half my city thought I was a serial dater with anger issues. As I scrolled, I recognized a username, Rachel, a woman I'd gone on one dinner date with months ago. Another comment hinted at patterns. None of it was true. All of it was permanent enough to follow me into conference rooms and client dinners. I called Daniel. He denied it, then blamed a friend. Then, 2 days later, admitted he'd done it himself because I seemed too good to be true. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just gossip. It was control, fear dressed up as concern, and it was already spilling into my professional life. I didn't know then how far it would go, or how much I'd have to lose before I took my power back. If you met me today, you'd probably assume I'm the kind of woman who has everything figured out. I look organized. I speak confidently. I can walk into a hospital wing with a tote bag full of samples and a smile that says I belong here, even when I'm running on airport coffee and 4 hours of sleep. But the truth is, I became that woman because I had to. I'm 34, and I work in pharmaceutical sales across the Northeast. It's a good job, competitive, high pressure, high reward. My calendar is always full. Client lunches, product trainings, early morning drives, last-minute meetings. Some months I'm on the road 1 week out of 4, sometimes more. It pays well enough that I can live alone in a clean apartment, keep my life stable, and not feel like I'm drowning every time a bill hits my inbox. But dating? Dating is where my life always feels complicated. I'm not a casual dater. I don't do the talk to 5 people at once thing. I don't thrive in chaos. I'm private, so private that I don't even use social media much. No curated highlights, no relationship posts, no soft launch stories. Just me, my friends, my work, and the quiet routines that keep me grounded. My last serious relationship ended over a year ago. Not because of one dramatic explosion, more like a slow erosion. 2 people who cared but didn't fit. When it ended, I promised myself I wouldn't rush into the next thing just because I missed having someone. So I took a break, focused on work, focused on myself. And for months, every time I opened a dating app, it felt like stepping into a noisy room where everyone was yelling to be chosen. Then I matched with Daniel. He was 32, an elementary school teacher, and his messages didn't feel like performance. He didn't start with a cheesy line. He asked real questions, the kind that told me he was paying attention, not just collecting responses. We texted for about 2 weeks before meeting. And early, almost immediately, I told him the thing I always tell people, because it's the part that scares them off. I travel for work, regularly. It's not negotiable. And I need someone who won't turn that into a suspicion. I remember staring at my phone after sending it, waiting for the usual fade out. But Daniel replied with something simple. That makes sense. Thanks for being upfront. I'm looking for something real too. He told me his last relationship ended because his ex couldn't handle how committed he was to his students. Late parent conferences, weekend grading, always being on. He didn't say it like a complaint, more like a fact about his life, a responsibility, a part of who he was. That, weirdly, made me trust him more. We planned our first date for the weekend before Valentine's Day. He suggested Italian. I picked a new place downtown that had just opened. Warm lighting, not too fancy, but nice enough to show I cared. When I arrived, Daniel stood up immediately, smiled like he was genuinely happy to see me, not just checking a box. Dinner lasted almost 3 hours. We talked about childhood memories, career goals, stupid little preferences like how we both hated crowded bars, and the way it felt to finally be in your 30s and stop pretending you wanted what everyone else wanted. Afterward, we walked to a dessert shop for tiramisu and coffee. Outside, the air was cold, and the city lights reflected on the sidewalk like someone had spilled gold across the pavement. When we got back to his car, he kissed me goodnight. It wasn't a polite kiss. It was the kind that made me sit in my own car afterward and stare at the steering wheel for a second, smiling, thinking, oh, this could be something. The next day, I called him because I'm that kind of woman. If I had a good time, I say it. I told him I'd love to see him again. Then I mentioned my next trip, Wednesday through Friday, February 15th to 17th, about 3 hours away for client meetings. Daniel didn't hesitate. Okay, he said, voice bright. We'll plan something when you're back. And I believed him. Because nothing in those first weeks gave me any warning that his idea of being careful wasn't a conversation. It was a public trial. Looking back, the warning signs weren't loud. They never are. They were small things, easy to dismiss, the kind you only recognize as patterns after everything collapses. The week before my trip, Daniel started asking questions that felt slightly off. Not aggressive, not accusatory, just threaded with a tension I couldn't quite place. So, what's your schedule like when you travel? Do you usually go out with clients in the evenings? Are these trips mostly men or mixed teams? At first, I answered without hesitation. I'd had these conversations before. My job was unfamiliar to people who worked more predictable hours, and curiosity made sense. Still, something about the frequency stuck with me. The way he circled back to the same topic. The way his tone shifted just enough to register in my body, even if my brain brushed it aside. On Tuesday night, the night before I left, he texted, "Are you nervous about the trip?" I paused before replying. "No," I wrote, "just busy." He sent back a laughing emoji. Then, "Guess I just worry. You seem really put together." At the time, I read that as a compliment. Now I know better. Wednesday morning, I left early, airport routine, coffee in a paper cup, laptop balanced on my knees. Daniel texted me safe travels. I smiled at my phone, the kind of smile you don't even notice you're making. During the trip, we texted occasionally. Nothing intense, just check-ins. He knew I had back-to-back meetings and client dinners. I didn't disappear. I didn't dodge questions. I lived my life exactly the way I told him I would. On Friday afternoon, as I packed up my hotel room, my phone buzzed. It was Megan. "Who did you piss off?" I frowned and typed back, "What?" The screenshot came through before I could hit send. And suddenly the air in the room felt thinner. There was my photo, one I recognized from the dating app. Cropped, shared, framed in a way that invited judgment. The website banner read something like, "Name and Shame Dating," a local group with tens of thousands of members. The comments scrolled endlessly. Some were dismissive. "Went on one date, nice enough." "Paid for dinner but never followed up." Others were worse. "Message me privately for details." "Trust your gut, there's something off." "Has anger issues, avoid." I recognized that username immediately. Rachel, a woman I'd gone on one date with the previous summer. After dinner, she'd texted me constantly about adopting her sister's cat, a 3-legged rescue with expensive medical needs. I'd said no, gently, repeatedly. I traveled too much. It wouldn't be fair to the animal. She wouldn't let it go. Eventually, I blocked her number. And now she was here, resurrected in the comment section, rewriting me as someone dangerous. By the time I drove home that evening, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Friends, acquaintances, my sister. Even my neighbor stopped me in the hallway, eyes bright with curiosity. "I saw you online," she said, like she'd spotted a celebrity. I laughed weakly. My hands were shaking. This wasn't just embarrassing. This was destabilizing. That night, I sat on my couch and replayed every recent interaction in my head. Who could have posted it? The timing was too precise. I'd only been on one date recently. There was only one person who could have done this. I called Daniel Saturday morning. At first, he denied it completely, sounded confused, hurt that I'd even ask. Then, when I pressed, the story shifted. He said a friend had posted it, that he'd shown her my picture during a Valentine's Day singles night, and she'd taken it upon herself because my work trip seemed suspicious. He apologized, said he felt terrible, explained that his last relationship ended because his ex cheated and he'd been blindsided. Said he should have trusted his instincts instead of letting his friends spiral. I listened. I understood fear, but something inside me had already started to crack. Because even if it had been a friend, why hadn't he asked me first? Why had strangers gotten access to my face, my name, my life, before I even knew there was a problem? And deep down, I already suspected the truth. I just wasn't ready to hear it yet. The lie didn't unravel all at once. It seeped out slowly, like water through a crack you didn't know was there until the floor started warping beneath your feet. Saturday passed with me replaying Daniel's explanation over and over. I wanted to believe him. Not because it made sense, but because the alternative meant admitting I'd misjudged someone I'd felt safe with. And that's a harder truth to swallow than embarrassment. Sunday came and went without a word from him. By Monday morning, my phone buzzed before my alarm went off. Daniel, one message, then another, then 10 more. Apologies stacked on top of each other. Paragraphs instead of sentences. Panic bleeding through the screen. Finally, a line that made my chest tighten. I need to tell you the truth. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and called him. He didn't deny it this time. I posted it, he said quietly. Not my friend. Me. There it was. No build-up, no softening. Just the truth dropped into the space between us like a weight. He said he panicked. Said the timing of my trip triggered something in him. Said I seemed too good to be true, successful, confident, calm, and that scared him. He said he only meant to check if anyone else had dated me, to protect himself. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the wall. Protect himself. At my expense. Then came the part that made my skin crawl. Daniel started sending me screenshots. Private messages from the group. Threads I hadn't even seen. Women dissecting my life like it was public property. Where I took them on dates. What car I drove. Guesses about my salary. Speculation about my body. Assumptions about intimacy that were completely fabricated. Some of the comments weren't even from women I'd dated. They were strangers, filling in blanks with their imagination. I felt nauseous. I didn't participate, Daniel rushed to say. I swear, I just read them. Read them, as if that made it better. As if consuming the violation instead of contributing to it somehow kept his hands clean. I asked him the question that had been burning in my throat since the moment I saw my face online. Why didn't you ask me? Silence. Then, my friend said asking would tip you off if you were lying. That was it. That was the moment something fundamental shifted. This wasn't fear. This wasn't trauma. This was distrust dressed up as self-protection. We met later that week at a coffee shop near my apartment. I chose the place deliberately. Bright, public, neutral. I didn't want intimacy. I wanted clarity. Daniel apologized again, told me he'd deleted the post, showed me confirmation emails, said he'd asked the admins to remove the comments. Then another truth slipped out. He wasn't fresh out of a breakup like he'd told me. He was divorced, 6 months ago, cheated on repeatedly throughout his marriage. I watched his hands shake as he spoke. I believed his pain. I really did. But pain doesn't excuse harm, and it doesn't entitle you to burn someone else's life down just to feel safe. As we talked, I noticed something else. He kept checking his phone, every few minutes. When I asked, he admitted he was monitoring the site, making sure no new comments appeared. It helps my anxiety, he said. It didn't help mine. I pointed it out gently, told him it didn't feel healthy, for either of us. He put the phone away, but his leg bounced under the table, restless, on edge. Before we left, he asked if we could start over. A second date, a clean slate. Promised nothing like this would ever happen again. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was I could forgive him, but I couldn't unknow what I now knew. That he was capable of violating my privacy before we'd even built trust. That when afraid, his instinct wasn't communication, it was surveillance. That night I talked to my friends. Megan was furious. Lisa tried to play devil's advocate, said these groups existed for safety. I understood the intention, but intention doesn't erase impact. When Daniel texted the next evening asking if I'd decided, I felt something settle in my chest. I could already imagine the future. Every business trip, every late meeting, every unanswered text. Trust isn't something you rebuild when it was never properly laid in the first place. I called him. Told him gently but firmly that I didn't think we should continue. He cried, said he'd never felt a connection like this before. Then, almost casually, he mentioned details about my apartment. My bookshelf, the artwork in my living room. I'd never invited him inside. The room went cold. Those details could only have come from the private messages he claimed not to have read. When I pointed it out, he changed the subject. I ended the call shortly after. The next morning, I woke up to an email from him. Long, detailed. Attached screenshots of everything, every comment, every private message. I wanted you to understand, he wrote. It didn't feel like understanding. It felt like exposure again. That was when I blocked his number, his email, every path he could use to reach me. I thought that was the end. I was wrong. For a few days after I blocked Daniel, I lived in a strange in-between state. Outwardly, I functioned. I answered emails. I showed up to meetings. I smiled at clients and hit my talking points with practiced ease. On paper, nothing had changed. Inside, everything felt exposed. Every time my phone buzzed, my shoulders tightened. Every unfamiliar number made my pulse spike. I kept imagining my name popping up in places I couldn't see. Group chats, private forums, whispered conversations between people who thought they knew me because they'd read a paragraph online. It wasn't fear in the dramatic sense. It was a low-grade vigilance that never shut off. I kept asking myself the same questions in different forms. Did I miss something obvious? Was I naive to trust so easily? Did I invite this by being too open or not open enough? That kind of self-interrogation is insidious. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It convinces you that maybe, somehow, you were responsible for someone else's choices. I talked it through with Megan one night over takeout. She listened without interrupting, eyes dark with anger on my behalf. You didn't do anything wrong, she said finally. You told the truth. He didn't like what the truth made him feel. I wanted to believe her. Lisa, on the other hand, took a more complicated stance. She acknowledged Daniel crossed a line, but still framed it as fear, as a byproduct of trauma. Some people don't know how to handle uncertainty, she said. It doesn't mean they're evil. I agreed, mostly. But understanding why someone hurts you doesn't make the hurt disappear. I decided to focus on the practical. I asked Megan to keep an eye on the site since I didn't want to see it myself anymore. I documented everything, screenshots, emails, timestamps, and saved them to a folder I hoped I'd never need. I went back to work, burying myself in preparation for a major client presentation. Concentration came in waves. Some moments I felt steady. Others, my mind drifted back to the comments, the assumptions people had made about me without ever meeting me. Then, 2 weeks later, everything escalated. I was at a pharmaceutical conference in Boston, representing my company at a networking reception. Glass walls, name badges, polite conversation is layered over professional ambition. I was mid-conversation with a cardiologist when a woman approached me, smiling. "You're the woman from the name and shame site, right?" The words hit like a slap. I managed to keep my face neutral. She wasn't hostile, almost amused. She explained she recognized me from a friend who'd commented on the post. A different city, 3 hours away. The reach of it suddenly felt enormous. I excused myself and stepped into the restroom, locking myself in a stall just to breathe. When I got home, there was more. An anonymous account had contacted several of my colleagues and clients on a professional networking platform, claiming I had a history of inappropriate behavior. 2 clients reached out to my manager. Thankfully, my boss knows me, trusts me. He shut it down, but not before I had to sit in his office and explain the entire situation. The site, the date, the lies. I hated that part the most. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because someone else's paranoia had forced my private life into my professional space. The timing made one thing clear. Daniel wasn't done, or someone connected to him wasn't. 3 days later, I got a text from an unknown number. It was Rachel, the woman from the comments. She asked if we could talk. Every instinct told me not to, but curiosity and a need for answers won. We met at a busy coffee shop. Rachel apologized first, immediately. She admitted the comment she'd posted about me was fabricated, said she'd been going through a rough time when we met and took out her frustration on me. Then she dropped the real bomb. She knew Daniel. They worked at the same school. And Daniel had a history. Obsessive patterns, boundary issues, inappropriate contact with people in his orbit. Rachel showed me screenshots from a private group chat, messages where Daniel discussed making me regret rejecting him, monitoring my online presence, reaching out to my workplace. I felt cold all over. I asked Rachel why she was telling me this now. She said guilt and fear. She didn't like how far things were going. After that meeting, I called a lawyer friend. His advice was simple: document everything, inform HR, protect yourself. I followed it, and for the first time since this began, I stopped asking what I'd done wrong and started asking what I needed to do to feel safe. Once I stopped questioning my own reality, everything sharpened into focus. The confusion faded, the self-doubt loosened its grip. What replaced it wasn't rage, it was clarity. And clarity is dangerous to people who rely on manipulation. The first thing I did was meet with HR. I didn't dramatize, I didn't speculate. I laid out facts, timelines, screenshots, and the lawyer's advice. I explained the anonymous messages sent to colleagues and clients, the dating site, and the prior contact I'd already blocked. The HR director listened carefully, took notes, asked measured questions. Then she told me something I didn't realize I needed to hear. "You did the right thing coming forward early." She assured me that if any further contact came through professional channels, it would be handled formally and documented, that my position was secure, that my performance spoke for itself. I walked out of her office lighter than I had in weeks. But the situation itself didn't disappear. Megan continued monitoring the site. One afternoon, she texted me, "Your post is gone. Not just hidden, gone. The comments too." Either Daniel had followed through on deleting everything, or the admins had purged it as part of their rotation. I didn't care which. What mattered was that my face was no longer pinned to a digital wall. Still, the sense of being watched lingered. Twice in 1 week, I noticed the same car parked near my apartment building. Once when I left for work, once when I came home. It could have been coincidence. Probably was. But after everything, I stopped dismissing my instincts. I varied my routine, took different routes, let friends know where I was. Not out of panic, out of self-respect. Then came another twist. Rachel reached out again. She invited me to meet, not to talk about Daniel, but to apologize properly. She explained she'd recognized a pattern in herself too, latching onto people during periods of emotional overwhelm. She was involved in animal rescue, constantly taking on more than she could manage. We talked for over 2 hours, about boundaries, about projection, about how easily hurt turns into harm when it's left unchecked. She told me the three-legged cat had found a home, with an elderly couple who adored him. We laughed. It was strange and grounding and unexpectedly human. Around that time, I heard through Megan that Daniel hadn't tried to contact me directly, but there were whispers. A sense that he was still circling, still telling his version of the story. I refused to engage. That's the thing about escalation. You don't always have to climb it. Sometimes you step aside and let the other person exhaust themselves. Work became my anchor. I poured my energy into preparing for a major regional presentation. Late nights, early mornings. Focus sharp enough to cut through lingering anxiety. When the presentation day came, I stood in front of a room full of executives and spoke with steady confidence, answered questions without flinching, held my ground. 2 weeks later, my manager called me into his office. I assumed it was about numbers. It wasn't. They were promoting me. Regional sales manager. He mentioned my performance, my leadership, and, carefully, the professionalism I'd shown during recent personal challenges. I thanked him, voice calm, heart pounding. That promotion wasn't just a career win. It was proof that my life hadn't been derailed. Then, finally, Daniel reached out again. Not directly, through his therapist. An email arrived with formal wording and explicit permission attached. The therapist explained Daniel was addressing anxious attachment patterns and trust issues related to his divorce. She said he recognized his behavior toward me was inappropriate and harmful. He wasn't asking for reconciliation. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. I didn't respond immediately. I consulted my lawyer friend again. He said a brief, neutral response, acknowledging receipt, setting a boundary, could provide closure without reopening anything. So I did. 1 sentence. No emotion, no explanation. I acknowledge receipt of this message and wish Daniel well in his recovery. Please respect my request for no further contact. The therapist replied, thanking me, and assured me that would be the end of communication. And it was. The weeks after that were quiet. No anonymous messages, no sightings, no new rumors. The quiet felt earned. I went to dinner parties again, reconnected with friends, even exchanged numbers with someone new. Not a date, not a promise, just a possibility. For the first time since this began, my nervous system started to relax. I wasn't back to normal. I was different, more selective, more grounded, more aware of the power of boundaries. And the story wasn't over yet, but it was moving towards something else. The quiet didn't bring relief the way I expected. Instead, it brought the reckoning. When everything finally slowed down, when there were no new emails to document, no screenshots to file away, no urgent conversations to manage, the weight of what had happened settled in my body all at once. I realized how long I'd been holding my breath. The dark moment didn't arrive as a single event. It came in pieces, in ordinary moments that should have felt safe. Like standing in my kitchen late one evening, staring at the reflection in the microwave door, suddenly wondering how many strangers still remembered my face, or lying in bed, phone on the nightstand, feeling a jolt of fear when it vibrated, even when it was just a calendar reminder. I wasn't in danger anymore. But my nervous system hadn't caught up. There was one night in particular that broke something open. I'd had dinner with friends. Nothing dramatic, just laughter and shared plates and a sense of normalcy I'd been craving. When I got home, I kicked off my shoes, dropped my bag, and sank onto the couch. The silence pressed in. That's when the thought hit me, sharp and uninvited. What if this had gone just a little further? What if my manager hadn't trusted me? What if a client had believed the anonymous message? What if someone had decided I wasn't worth the risk? I pictured my career unraveling because of a stranger's post. Years of work reduced to rumors. Control taken from me because someone else couldn't manage their fear. My chest tightened. I cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just tears sliding down my face as I stared at nothing, mourning a version of myself that had believed honesty was always enough to keep you safe. I thought about Daniel then, not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted sadness, about how his pain had metastasized into something harmful, about how quickly empathy can turn into a trap if you let it override self-protection. I also thought about myself, about how easily I'd minimized my discomfort in the early days, how I'd rationalized his questions, how I'd wanted to be understanding because I'd been hurt before too. There's a fine line between compassion and self-erasure. I crossed it without realizing. The next day, I didn't go to work. I took a personal day, something I rarely do. I turned off notifications, silenced my phone, and let myself feel everything I'd been postponing. I wrote in a notebook I hadn't touched in years. Not neatly, not coherently, just pages of raw, unfiltered thoughts. I didn't deserve this. Being cautious doesn't justify violating someone. Trust isn't something you test. It's something you build. At some point, the writing slowed, my breathing steadied, and something shifted. The dark moment wasn't about fear anymore. It was about grief. Grief for the ease I used to feel moving through the world. Grief for the version of dating that didn't require mental armor. Grief for the assumption that if you did everything right, you'd be protected. That assumption died, and in its place, something sturdier began to form. That afternoon, I went for a long walk. No headphones, just the sound of the city, traffic, footsteps, distant laughter, life continuing, indifferent to my internal storm. I realized something important. This experience had not broken me. It had shown me where I needed stronger boundaries. It had exposed the cost of ignoring early discomfort in the name of being nice. And as heavy as that realization was, it was also clarifying. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Not because everything was resolved, but because I finally stopped fighting the truth. The lowest point wasn't when my face was plastered online. It was when I almost convinced myself that enduring harm was the price of empathy. And I wasn't willing to pay that anymore. The turning point didn't come with fireworks or confrontation. It arrived quietly, on a Tuesday morning, in a moment so ordinary I almost missed it. I was standing in front of my closet, deciding what to wear for a client visit, when my phone buzzed with an email notification. For the first time in weeks, my body didn't tense. I glanced at the screen. Nothing urgent, nothing threatening, just quiet. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not waiting for another message. Not waiting for an apology that would finally make things make sense. Not waiting for validation that I'd been wronged. The vigilance that had lived in my shoulders for weeks had loosened its grip. That was power returning. Later that day, I had coffee with Megan. We sat by the window, sunlight catching the rim of our mugs. She studied my face for a long moment before smiling. "You look like yourself again," she said. I laughed softly. "I think I finally am." We talked, not about Daniel, not about the site, but about everything else. Work, travel plans, the way life had a habit of expanding once fear stopped dictating your choices. That night, I did something small but meaningful. I deleted the folder. Not the documentation. I kept that archived safely. but the working folder I'd been opening daily, the one that kept me tethered to vigilance. I didn't need to live there anymore. The real shift came a few days later, during a check-in with my therapist. I'd started seeing her regularly after everything escalated, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand why I'd tolerated certain things longer than I should have. She asked a simple question. What would you do differently next time? I didn't answer right away. Then I said it. I'd listen to my discomfort sooner. I wouldn't explain it away, just to keep the peace. She nodded. That's not becoming guarded. That's becoming discerning. That distinction mattered more than I realized. I wasn't closing myself off. I was refining access. Around the same time, I received a message from someone I'd met at a friend's dinner party weeks earlier. We'd exchanged numbers casually. No expectations. No pressure. He suggested coffee. And for the first time since all of this began, I noticed something new. I didn't feel compelled to explain myself. I didn't preemptively justify my schedule. I didn't overshare to prove my honesty. I didn't perform transparency as a shield. I simply said yes. The date was fine, pleasant, easy. And when we both realized after a few outings that the spark wasn't there, we said so. No drama, no spirals, no retaliation. Just two adults recognizing a mismatch. That normalcy felt revolutionary. The final piece fell into place when I read a local news article about dating blacklist sites, investigative reporting, interviews with people, men and women, whose lives had been disrupted by false or exaggerated posts. The site I'd been posted on announced new moderation policies, verification requirements, evidence thresholds. It didn't erase what had happened to me, but it validated something important. This wasn't just my story. It was a pattern, and I'd navigated it without losing myself. That night, I sat on my couch with a glass of wine and reflected, not with bitterness, but with perspective. Daniel's pain was real. So was mine. But pain doesn't entitle someone to control another person's narrative. And boundaries aren't punishments. They're permissions to live freely. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't afraid. I was done. And being done didn't mean shutting the door on connection. It meant choosing it wisely. The fallout didn't arrive with a bang. It came in ripples. Quiet consequences spreading outward, touching everyone who had tried to control the story without ever owning the truth. I didn't initiate anything. I didn't post rebuttals. I didn't warn mutual acquaintances. I didn't expose screenshots publicly, even though I could have. I simply stepped back. And when you do that, when you stop feeding a narrative built on fear, it collapses under its own weight. Over the following weeks, small things started reaching me indirectly. A colleague mentioned, casually, that the anonymous account that had contacted clients had disappeared. A client I hadn't spoken to since the incident invited me to lunch and said, without prompting, "By the way, none of that nonsense made sense to us." Another contact told me someone had tried to ask around about me and had been shut down immediately. The rumors didn't just stop. They reversed. Because once people realized there was no evidence, no pattern, no corroboration, the story lost oxygen. Meanwhile, Daniel's world narrowed. Rachel told me later, carefully, without drama, that the school administration had placed him on leave pending review. Not because of me directly, but because multiple boundary issues had come to light once people started comparing notes. Things that had been dismissed individually now formed a pattern. I felt no satisfaction hearing that. Just a steady confirmation that consequences don't require vengeance. They require truth. The therapist's email was the last communication I ever received connected to him. There were no more indirect attempts, no third-party check-ins, no apologies that asked for absolution. Whatever work he needed to do, he had to do it without me. Professionally, my life stabilized in a way that felt almost surreal after the chaos. The promotion became real. New responsibilities, new travel, new authority. I noticed something unexpected. I stopped apologizing for my schedule. I stated it plainly, confidently, as a fact, not a liability. People met me where I stood. Friends commented on the shift too. "You don't over-explain anymore," Megan said one night. "You just say what you need." I hadn't noticed until she pointed it out. But she was right. The emotional aftermath settled differently than I'd expected. There was no lingering urge to win, no desire to see someone punished. What I felt instead was distance, clean, deliberate distance from a version of my life that no longer fit. Dating slowly re-entered my world, but on my terms. I changed apps, chose platforms with verification, trusted my instincts when conversations felt off, and honored them when they felt grounded. I didn't chase chemistry. I observed behavior, and when something didn't align, I left quietly. No explanations owed, no guilt carried. One evening, I received a message from Rachel, just a photo, a group of volunteers at an animal rescue fundraiser. She thanked me for listening when she needed to make amends. We'd never become close friends, but something respectful had formed between us. Accountability, without obligation. It felt healthy. The last ripple came when a local news segment aired, an investigative piece on dating blacklist sites and reputational harm. They talked about moderation failures, about how fear-driven communities can morph into surveillance spaces. I watched from my couch, arms wrapped around a pillow, heart steady. I wasn't interviewed, I wasn't named, and I didn't need to be. My life had already moved forward. The fallout landed where it belonged, not on me. I didn't walk away triumphant. I walked away intact. With my career stronger, my boundaries sharper, my sense of self reclaimed. And that was enough. I don't think about him much anymore. Not because I've erased what happened, but because it no longer defines me. Life filled the space where anxiety used to live. Workdays blurred into progress instead of vigilance. My calendar stayed full, but not overwhelming. I traveled, presented, negotiated, and came home to an apartment that finally felt quiet in the right way. The kind of quiet that signals safety. I'm still dating, but differently now. I don't rush connection. I don't mistake intensity for intimacy. I don't confuse someone's fear with depth. And I no longer feel obligated to make myself smaller, simpler, or more understandable to be trusted. Trust isn't something you earn by over-disclosing. It's something that grows when both people choose honesty and restraint. What this experience taught me isn't that people are dangerous. It's that boundaries are not barriers to love. They're filters. They let the right people through. I learned that empathy without limits becomes self-betrayal, that protecting your privacy doesn't make you secretive, it makes you sovereign, and that walking away quietly can be more powerful than any public defense. Most importantly, I learned to listen to the part of myself that notices discomfort before it becomes harm. That voice is calm. It doesn't shout. It doesn't justify itself. It just knows. If you're watching this and you've ever felt exposed, misrepresented, or punished for someone else's fear, this is what I want you to remember. You are allowed to choose peace over explanation. You are allowed to leave before things escalate. And you don't owe anyone access to your life just because they ask for it. Some bridges don't need to be rebuilt. Not because people can't change, but because you already did. And sometimes moving forward with clarity and compassion for yourself is the strongest ending there is.